Hey, it's Joshua with Cultural Catholic coming at you with the second and final of the Dharmic religions, Buddhism, otherwise known as the Way of Suffering. Typical structure. The history of Buddhism is that it originally started with a man named Siddhartha Gautama, who is otherwise known as the Shakyamuni Buddha. And he was born and predicted to be either a great political leader or a great religious leader. While his father was reputed to be a very religious man, he was also very practical, and to that end, he did everything he could to make sure that his son grew up to be a great king and military leader. Uh, Basically, how politics worked back in the 6th century BCE. Um, However, that did not last very long, as the Buddha, as he would later become to known, uh, felt that there was something missing in his decadent life. So he convinced his father to let him go out. Granted, his father did his best to sanitize the world he saw. And the Buddha is as the story goes, reported to have seen three separate individuals on three separate days: a sick man, an old man, and a dead body. And in each case, the one who would be known as the Buddha asked, "What is this thing? Why is this thing happening?" And his companion, his chariot driver, would say, "Everyone gets sick, everyone gets old, everyone dies." And Siddhartha had a uh, an existential crisis, and he ultimately decided to leave his father, his wife, his child, and become a wandering ascetic, um, who actually was the fourth thing that he saw. Uh, and he'd been told that an ascetic is someone who's trying to uh, find enlightenment and ultimately break the cycle of death and rebirth. Because Buddhism came out of Hinduism, um, and ultimately, uh, Siddhartha Gautama spent many, many years trying to achieve enlightenment by going to various teachers, studying under various students, doing all sorts of different things that were part of Hinduism at the time, because he was a Hindu and he was originally from Nepal. Um, and then, but he ultimately came to this uh, uh, understanding under a tree, and he became the Buddha, and then after a while he started to spread his message. And when he died, as at the head of this group of wandering monks and nuns who were all beggars, ultimately his teachings were spread throughout what would become India and East Asia. Uh, Now, onto some important doctrines and texts. There are two very important aspects of Buddhism that ultimately define it. These are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So, the Four Noble Truths um, is that the first truth states that everything is that everyone suffers. That suffering is part of the world. Second uh, uh, is that desire is the cause of suffering. So the idea is everyone suffers for some reason, and that suffering is caused by a desire for something. Um, the third path, the third truth is that uh, for suffering to end, um, uh, duality needs to be recognized, and by recognizing that, you ultimately achieve nirvana. And nirvana means to extinguish in Sanskrit, um, uh, and it means extinguishment from suffering. Um, and to ultimately achieve nirvana is that you must follow the Eightfold Path, which is what the fourth noble truth is. And the Eightfold Path is right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And these can be divided up pretty evenly into three themes. Um, so, good moral contact, which is understanding, thought, and speech, meditation and mental development, which is action, livelihood, and effort, and wisdom or insight, which is mindfulness and concentration. Basically, it says be ethical, uh, uh, be wise, and always be changing. Now, another important part of Buddhism is the idea that everything is constantly changing. So every second of every day, I am constantly changing. Every second of every day, this ironing board is always changing. The idea is that nothing is a set, and nothing is intrinsically going to be the same all of the time. Basically, life is always changing, and that can help, and that is a contributing factor to the suffering that Buddhism is trying to be the answer to. Um, Now, a lot of most religions have very important sacred texts. The thing with Buddhism, since it came out of the adaptive nature of Hinduism, um, and we'll get to this later. Buddhism ultimately started to create, through one of its branches, a multitude of sacred texts and scriptures. Ultimately, there are too many to get into because there's at least one for every form of Buddhism. Um, and um, the long and the short is, depending on what form of Buddhism you practice, depends on the scripture that you read. I've read several of them because I also took I took several religious studies classes, and one of them we read scriptures from Buddhist texts. Well, actually, a compilation of Buddhist texts, um, and there's a lot of them. Um, and I have a feeling we barely scratched the surface with the texts that were in the compilation. Um, so yeah, and then the splits within Buddhism. Like I said, there's a sacred text for every form of Buddhism, and there are three important groups. I'll get into a little bit more detail of one of the many branches within one, but there's Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. I'm not really good with Sanskrit. So Theravada is the elder's path. And the basic structure of this is that uh, within Buddhism, Buddhism is reputed to be the first to have monasticism, or the establishment of monasteries for monks and nuns. And the idea is that you die and are reborn until you get to the point where you become a monk. Uh, and the ultimate goal within Theravada Buddhism is to get to that point where you can be a monk. Because once you become a monk, you can get to that point where you can become an arhat, or one who has become enlightened. Not Buddha enlightened, but to the point where you are able to leave the cycle of death and rebirth, um, and achieve nirvana. Um, uh, and like I said, this is a very monastic form of Buddhism. It's a little closer to what Buddhism turned into after the death of the Shakyamuni Buddha, um, who was the first Buddha. Uh, and this is really the only survivor of the uh, uh, um, uh, opponent of Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana means greater vehicle. Um, and they call Theravada Hinayana, which means lesser vehicle. Anyways, so Mahayana Buddhism is kind of very similar to popular Hinduism in that you don't need to die and get reborn to ultimately achieve where you need to get to achieve nirvana, or in Hinduism's case, moksha. But you once you hit, but in Mahayana Buddhism, the common person, the lay person, is able to achieve nirvana in this lifetime. Um, because nirvana is not something you go to when you're after you're dead. You achieve it, and then afterwards you go to nirvana once you die, and you're not reborn again and again. Um, so the main crux of the difference that also another of the main cruxes that differentiates Mahayana and Theravada is that in Mahayana there are individuals called bodhisattvas, and bodhisattvas are basically Buddhas, that individuals that achieve Buddhahood but keep on coming back until everyone can achieve nirvana. Uh, the example that the metaphor that Prothero uses is it's this guy at the party and he's holding open the door and waving everyone into the party before going in himself. Um, and there's quite a few large sects of Mahayana Buddhism. They are Zen, Pure Land, and Lotus. All of these are very popular in Japan. They're probably outside of Tibetan Buddhism, which I'll get into a little bit, are the most recognizable to Westerners. Um, and they all have their different ways of achieving nirvana. Pure Land, you have to chant the name of the Buddha who uh, achieved nirvana through Pure Land Buddhism, the Amida Buddha. Um, and that's either through multiple chants, which is what Pure Land is, or through just one invocation, which is what true Pure Land is. Lotus, it's very meditative, um, and uh, very much more of a individualistic. These all are fairly individualistic to an extent. And Zen is the one where practitioners, and all Buddhists are practitioners. They're not believers. They actually practice what they are trying to do to get to nirvana. They utilize kind of like mind games to ultimately understand the the falseness of duality. Now, Vajrayana, or Tibetan Buddhism, is very unique in that it combines Buddhism with with local traditions, um, and it actually sprung out of Mahayana itself, but it became its own thing with this isolation on the Tibetan plateau, and the very much introduction of various traditions. Um, one of the most visible traditions that we know of Tibetan Buddhism is the Dalai Lama, and to a lesser extent the Panchen Lama, who are these uh, uh, religious and political leaders who play uh, samsara hide and go seek with each other, and their job is to lead the Tibetan people to enlightenment, which in Tibetan Buddhism can actually happen in one lifetime. The easiest way the first step is to realize that the white light you see when you die is also you, and by realizing that, you achieve enlightenment and achieve nirvana. If that doesn't work, you then are paraded past ugly and beautiful Buddhas, and if you realize that they are you, you achieve enlightenment and nirvana. And if that doesn't work, you get to try all over again in the next life. Next death. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the major splits of Buddhism. Um, so modern Buddhism is found primarily in East and Southeast Asia. There are about uh, 445 million Buddhists, so that makes it the fourth largest religion after Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. About 175 million of those Buddhists live in China, with majorities in Thailand, um, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, and Japan, with minorities found a little bit in Africa and South America, a bigger minority in uh, Europe and North America, and there is a growing minority in India, which is the birthplace of Buddhism, as well as a decent number in Russia and Asian Russia and Mongolia. Um, and like I said, the most recognizable form of Buddhism in the Western world is Tibetan Buddhism, largely because of uh, China and its invasion of Tibet. Additionally, Buddhism has taken some hits with China and North Korea becoming communist and the growing Christian population in South Korea. However, it is very strong in the rest of uh, uh, where it is, as well as the growing minorities in the growing population in Australia. Um, so yeah, this is the end of the Dharmic religions. Next, and I probably missed some things because Buddhism, as well as Hinduism and all religions, there's a lot to cover, and there's only so much I can do in a 10 to 15-minute video. Next week, I'll be going on to the traditional Chinese religions. And yeah, this is Josh with Cultural Catholic signing off.